In the 17th century, Corelli's skill was highly praised and he was considered one of the virtuosos of the time. Why? That's what most modern historians say. Boyden, for instance, stated, "In the history of violin technique, Corelli's works cannot claim to be landmarks." Or McVeigh, scarcely one of the great virtuosi of his day. If we judge Corelli's virtuosity by modern standards only looking at what he wrote, then no, he wasn't a virtuoso. But that depends on how we define virtuosity. How did they define it in the 17th or 18th centuries? Is it possible, using different criteria, that Corelli was also a virtuoso? Let's consider the huge amount of different ways of holding the violin in those days as a first point. So you could hold it, nowadays you'd hold it like this, with the chin. That's the recognizable way in most orchestras. Then there is the chin off way, where you just balance it. Then you can sort of jam it in here, which is quite a stable position. And then there are certainly lower ways, or even with bigger, lower instruments, viola bastarda, you can have it across the front and play it like this, with a strap then to hold it. So there was no straightforward way. Different techniques were used according to what school you came from, what area you learnt your trade in, or even what social status you were. Of course, this had a direct effect on how compositions were written and what techniques they called for. There are pictures and engravings showing lots of these violin holding techniques being used side by side at one chord. Although any violinist writing a treatise seems to have used that as a way of showing their own views on the matter, as in writing in a treatise. Johann Jakob Prünner in 1677 wrote, "If one wants truly to master the violin, one has to hold it under the chin, so that one holds the left arm bent hollow, like a circlet, and with a hollow bent hand, one lays the neck by the scroll between the hand and the thumb, and holds the violin with the chin securely enough that there is no reason to hold it with the left hand. Ta-da! Because otherwise it would be impossible to run upwards and downwards unless one were to hold the violin with the right hand to prevent it falling and thus miss various notes, because you can't play and hold the violin at the same time. Nevertheless," he goes on, "I have known a fair number of virtuosi who did not observe this rule and put their violin only against the chest, thinking it would be beautiful and graceful, because they copied it from a painting in which the angel played for St. Francis. But they should have known that this painter may have been artistic with the brush, but he was not with the violin bow." On the other hand, John Lenton writes in 1693, "As I would have none get a habit of holding an instrument under the chin, so I would have them avoid placing it as low as the girdle, which is a mongrel sort of way used by some in imitation of the Italians." No doubt he was thinking of Nicola Matthes, who had come to England some 20 years earlier. Here's Roger North on Matthes. "A very robust and tall man, having long arms, held his instrument almost against his girdle, and his bow was as long for a bass viol, and he touched his division," that's ornamentation to you and me, "with the very point tip of the bow, and I have found very few that will believe it possible he could perform as he did in that posture." And what about Corelli? Do we have any paintings of how he played, how he held the violin? Well, we have a couple of portraits where he's holding a violin, but holding a violin up, we don't have any portraits. There is, however, an engraving of a concert by Christopher Shaw showing a full-blown outdoors performance with a big orchestra and Corelli leading as part of a small concertina group to the side. And he's holding his violin like this, down there. Now, Corelli learned to play the violin by a priest. So it wasn't an ordinary town musician. That's the difference I'm making there. And he had a high status background. Playing the violin was not really something you did in 17th century society, as holding the violin was considered inelegant and not suitable for someone with such a background, unless you make it look good. If you think that most lower class musicians held their instruments down here, maybe this was an attempt by them at finding inclusion in a higher circle. That's far-fetched, I know. Anyway, in Italy, it was a normal thing for virtuosos to perform with their instrument held low, some lower than others, or higher than others. Veracini, Locatelli and Gimignani were all virtuosos, certainly not known for gripping the violin with the chin. However, they probably held their instrument a little bit higher than Corelli. Holding it so low, it certainly does restrict you technically. Whereas with this one, I'm almost in the normal sort of, I can hold on fairly free, and like this, I can still reach quite a lot of the fingerboard. Actually, I could reach all of it, climbing up and down. But if I'm down here, then the body of the violin gets in the way at some point, and no matter how far I stick my elbow round, I will not be able to get much higher than this, unless I've got really long fingers. So there are anecdotes relating to some of Corelli's failures in this aspect. How could there not be? There was a performance of a piece by Scarlatti in Naples, and in this piece there was a passage going up to a high F. Now I'll show you where that high F is. There, that's the high F. Now up here it's fine, and down here it's quite difficult. It's manageable, just about, but it's quite difficult. And so Corelli bumbled, much to his shame, and he was even more ashamed when he realised that the Neapolitan leader and the other violinists all managed that passage with no problem at all. So he just stuck his tail between his legs and ran off back to Rome. And it gets worse. While Handel was in Rome just at the same time as Corelli, around 1707, and this time, Handel composed Il Trionfo del Tempo e della Verità. In it, there is a similar part in the overture where the two solo violins in the concertino, they have to go up to a top A. Now that's higher than in Scarlatti's. I'm sure Handel knew of this story with Corelli and the top F. And somehow I don't find it quite, not very sporting of Handel. Imagine being mobbed by this young, arrogant composer. Handel even wrote a violin sonata around that same time in Rome, in G major, HWV 358, and at the end of the last movement, there is a sudden jump, really, really high, right to the top, up into the stratosphere. I mean, whenever I play that bit, I can't help feeling really sorry for Corelli. So, if it wasn't his left-hand technique which would class Corelli as a virtuoso, what else could it be? What about his right hand? What about his bow technique? How was that? Robert Bremner wrote, "I have been informed that Corelli judged no performer fit to play in his band who could not, with one stroke of the bow, give a steady and powerful sound, like that of an organ, from two strings at once, and continue it for 10 seconds. And yet, it is said, the length of their bows at that time did not exceed 20 inches. Bremner is writing in 1777, fairly late, so maybe his 20 inches, that's just over 50 centimetres, is possibly a dated exaggeration, considering that Matthäus' bow was supposed to be almost or as long as a bass viols. Well, Matthäus did have long arms. This is my normal bow, and the short bow I worked out earlier would come to about here. Now it doesn't maybe seem much that is cut off, as it were, but when you actually play, it is quite a bit less. You end up shooting over the top and all that. But when you hold the violin down here, the bow arm is also much lower. There is almost no point in having a really long bow when you hold the violin low, because you can't stretch the arm further, unless of course you're like Matthäus and have really long arms. And what else? Corelli's orchestra. His orchestra. It was famed for its dynamics, for its work with the right hand. Charles de Brosse wrote, 1740, he notes, they have a manner of accompanying. It is the art of the augmentation and the diminution of sound. This is practiced either in barely gradable gradations or all at once. Besides the loud and the soft, or the very loud and the very soft, they also use a mezzo piano and a mezzo forte more or less accentuated. These are glimmers, half shades, which put an incredible grace into the colour of the sound. He also writes, this is an excellent effect. So Corelli's orchestral dynamics have obviously made a really strong impression on him. Unfortunately, we don't have many orchestral parts left. There aren't many extant where a musician has written in the dynamics that have been rehearsed. Of course, maybe they didn't do it and they were all spontaneous. Now, Corelli's compositions don't really explore any other positions than the first and the third. The pieces are written in such a way that shifting downwards, that's the difficult way, can almost be done always with an open string, so or a repetition of a same note. So either he's writing for a larger audience, or he's just not interested in these high, flashy positions. So there's one other thing in his compositions, and that is his incredible ornamentation. It's very fast, and there's a lot of notes, but it doesn't require shifting. So his virtuosity is not necessarily with the left hand. However, Corelli was able to the utmost degree to express sentiments, strike the imagination, affect the mind, and command the passions. That's John Hawkins writing in 1776. A person who had heard him perform says that whilst he was playing on the violin, it was usual for his countenance to be distorted, his eyes to become as red as fire, and his eyeballs to roll as in an agony. I think I would call Corelli a virtuoso, a right-hand virtuoso. Thank you for listening. See you again next time. Bye.